renewable energy.
All right, the Minister, Josh Frydenberg, is with me now live from Brisbane. Thanks for your time. So what is your reaction to those comments from your colleague Craig Kelly?
Well, renewable energy is not causing the death of Australians. We know that the renewable energy target does add $63 a year to the average household power bill, according to the Australian Energy Market Commission, but we also know that power bills have been going up for a variety of reasons, not least of which has been the tripling in gas prices over the last 5 years, not helped by the Labor states putting on bans and moratoriums on the development of gas. Where I do agree with Craig Kelly is that we need to do everything we can to put downward pressure on prices. Where the Commonwealth can act, it is, particularly around the restricting the gas exports and limiting the ability of the networks and the distribution companies to game the system. That's what we're doing, but the states also have to lift their game very significantly.
And I want to come to that, and I take your point on gas, but he's right, isn't he, that the renewable energy target does have an impact on prices. It has pushed up prices. You have been attacking the South Australian Labor government for its renewable target pushing up prices.
Well, the state government of South Australia has been negligent when it comes to preparing for the high penetration of wind and solar. If you look at a graph of the amount of renewables in each particular state, outside of hydro, of course, you see it spike in South Australia and dwarf that of other states. Now, that has caused real problems for the stability and the affordability of their electricity systems. So much so that they're paying, the highest prices in the national electricity market, and they have the least stable system, with the whole state going into a black event last September.
All right, but do you accept the national renewable energy target? Do you accept the federal government's RET has also pushed up prices?
Well, as I said, we've always known and said publicly that of what the Australian Energy Market Commission has said, which is it adds $63 to the average household bill. The renewable or green policies are about 8% of the household bill, about 12% is the retail prices, around 30% are the generation costs, and around 50% are the networks, the distributions and the transmission networks, the so-called poles and wires. That's what makes up an electricity bill.
There's no dispute about that. Your issue with Craig Kelly is that cost of $63 is therefore causing people to die.
Well, I don't accept that, quite clearly.
Understandably. The clean energy target that you're considering, the one that Alan Finkel has recommended, would mean a renewable target of 42% by 2030. Would that not mean even higher prices?
Well, as you know, Dr. Finkel, after 8 months, David, of consultation and aided by an expert panel, has produced 50 recommendations. The Commonwealth in record time has endorsed 49 of those, and we're seeking to progress them tomorrow at the COAG Energy Council meeting. The 50th recommendation is the clean energy target, and we'll consult and deliberate further, particularly internally, on that matter. And we don't need to rush it because it's only scheduled to come in on Dr. Finkel's timetable by 2020. So we've got to get it right. Policy in that area, we just can't afford to rush it. Now, the baseline that Dr. Finkel set in his model was at 0.6. 0.6 of a tonne of CO2 emitted for every megawatt of power produced. Now, that is one level that he's put, but he said that is not necessarily the most important decision to make when constructing a clean energy target. Now, depending on where that level is, could actually impact upon the amount of renewable energy. You're right. He said by 2030 there'd be 42% renewables in the system, but I point out that 9% of that is hydro, and that's a base load, 24/7 dispatchable form of power. Another 9% is for rooftop solar, and that doesn't change between a clean energy target or business as usual because it's not supported under a clean energy target. And the remaining 24% is large-scale wind and solar, and that would come into the system under Dr. Finkel's new recommendations, which is that renewables provide their own storage, and that's very important to understand. So it's not like with like in terms of comparing renewables today with renewables under Dr. Finkel's target. There is a different framework in which he's making these recommendations.
Let me turn to your meeting with the states tomorrow. You're not, as you say, going to be discussing the clean energy target. You are going to be putting pressure on them to lift gas moratoriums, particularly Victoria and the Northern Territory. You've been putting pressure on them for a while. What more can you do to force them to act?
Well, this is an extremely important issue because back in 2014, gas was setting the price of electricity less than 10% of the time. Now it's setting the price of electricity around 24-25% of the time. And in the last few years, we've seen gas prices increase astronomically as we export 2/3 of what we produce and the states lock up their own reserves from exploration and development. So what we need to do is keep that pressure on the states and say that regional and city jobs depend on affordable power and available gas. And by locking up these reserves, they are making the job much more difficult of keeping electricity prices low. And so that is a really important debate to have. Dr. Finkel himself has recommended that the states lift their moratoriums and bans and adopt a case-by-case scientific evidence-based approach. That's what we'll be encouraging to do. And I have to tell you, the states, and I'm talking about the Labor state of Victoria or indeed the Labor government in Northern Territory, they can't pick and choose which Finkel recommendations they want and ignore his recommendations around gas because it's too important to adopt.
You could say the same with respect to you, Minister. Can you pick and choose which recommendations to ignore? You haven't yet adopted the clean energy target.
Well, the Victorian government has said that this issue is closed when it comes to their gas development. What I've said about the 50th recommendation of Dr. Finkel is we'll continue to have internal discussions about that.
Some of the states are talking about going it alone with a clean energy target, a state-based clean energy target. Could that work? Is that possible?
Oh, look, this is political posturing again on the eve of COAG Energy Council meeting by the states. National problems require national solutions. And what we've seen in the past is states who go it alone have created inconsistency and an incoherency across the national electricity market. And the best example of that, David, is South Australia's behaviour with its own 50% renewable energy target and the pain and the cost that has been borne by its own citizens as a result. So we would encourage all states to go in a national approach.
I wanted to ask you about Queensland as well. Now, its state-owned generators there have been charging some of the highest wholesale prices in the country. And, of course, they're state-owned. The profit, of course, ends up in the state government's pocket. Do you believe there has been some, I don't know, jacking up of prices there, profiteering by the state-owned generators?
Well, the evidence is damning, absolutely damning, because as you point out, the wholesale component of the electricity bill makes up about 30% of the overall bill. And in Queensland, in the first 5 months of this year, the wholesale prices for electricity in that state were 30% above the national electricity market average. Since mid-2014, the times that the wholesale price has gone above $5,000 a megawatt hour in Queensland has been 30 times. The next closest state is South Australia at just 16 times. Now, all this time, the Queensland government has been booking higher and higher amounts of revenue from its two state-owned generators, Stanwell and CS Energy, who supply 65% of the energy into the Queensland market. So in the 2017-2018 budget, David, they booked $1.5 billion in revenue over the next 4 years. That was a 110% increase on the amount that was expected to be generated back in 2015, 2016. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Look at Gladstone's Boyne aluminium smelter, the managing director there, who has said that these excessive bidding practices by the generators have pushed higher prices and it's led to them having to stop production and cost jobs. I met today with Queensland Energy Users Network, and they pointed out that this was a hidden electricity tax in Queensland. So the Palaszczuk government has a real case to answer here. Why are they seeking to raise more money for their own coffers, to line their own coffers at the expense of Queensland households and businesses without telling them the truth.
A final question, Minister, on vehicle emissions. You've said no carbon tax on cars, but you are considering emissions standards that would push up the price of cars, wouldn't they?
Well, David, Australia has no vehicle efficiency standards, whereas 80% of the world passenger vehicle fleet does. And in other comparable countries like the United States, like the UK, across the European Union, Canada, Japan and Korea, they all have these fuel efficiency standards. So we've made no secret of the fact that we're interested in consulting industry and the other key stakeholders on the possibility of introducing such efficiency standards. Now, we put out a discussion paper late last year and a draft regulatory impact statement. It took recommendations, but it did point out that if you were to adopt such efficiency standards, you could save the average car driver, family car driver, up to $500 or more a year in their fuel costs. So, you know, it swings and roundabouts,
but certainly price would still be high.
Fuel efficiency standards. Look, there are impacts
save on the petrol, pay more for the
spectrum. Well, look, these can be argued. You can argue the toss on the details of the impacts, but the reality is most of the world has vehicle efficiency standards which have produced better economic and environmental outcomes.
Just before I let you go, I neglected to ask you earlier about Craig Kelly. Why is he still the chair of the backbench committee? Is that appropriate?
Look, these are decisions that we take internally. Craig's a good friend and a valued colleague. His views on a lot of these issues have been well known for some time. Obviously, I will disagree with him from time to time, as I've made clear on your show today.
But he's not going to lose that. He's not going to lose that position.
Together.
He won't lose that position.
They're not decisions for me. But David, they're not decisions for me other than to say Craig and I continue to work well together.
All right. Minister Josh Frydenberg, appreciate your time. Thanks very much for joining us.